Well, I've been working here in Santa Fe for about 7 years, and Oscar's my third production that I'm directing here. Very fortunate. And I did the world premiere of Lou Spratlin's Life is a Dream in 2010. So, based on that production, Charles asked me if I was interested in taking a look at this new opera about Oscar Wilde that Theodore Morrison and John Cox had written. And of course, my immediate reaction was yes. And it was a very easy decision. Oscar Wilde is a character, well, a person, a writer that I've been drawn to ever since I started reading, really. I started reading Oscar Wilde when I was fairly young, and I studied at Oxford in England, and of course, he's all over the British literary scene still today. Oscar Wilde is such an important character to study because not only was he a great writer and a kind of titan figure of late 19th century and of course carrying on to the 20th century after his death, but he really has a lot to teach us about compassion and humanity. People don't realize that he spent 2 years in prison, hard labor, solitary confinement, the complete dehumanization of a human being that was the hallmark of Victorian prisons. Those Victorian prisons were no joke. And of course, he went to jail for one reason and one reason only, and that was for being gay. And Oscar famously said, "There is no prison door into which love cannot force an entrance." And the piece really is about love and compassion and how we treat other human beings in the world. And if the audience takes anything away from Oscar's story, it's what he gave up for love and for his sexuality and for his beliefs. It's interesting to me to look at what Oscar actually learned during those 2 years of hard labor and solitary confinement in a Victorian prison. And a lot of the text in the opera comes from his own work, including the Ballad of Reading Gaol, about what he saw in prison, what he witnessed. What does Oscar learn from these other prisoners? What does he learn from his friends that stood by him? When he came out of prison, Oscar Wilde was completely penniless. He had no friends, and he died in complete isolation. He was ostracized. After being the toast of the town, he had plays all over the West End. His books were all bestsellers. He was the #1 invitee to every single party in London. And then once everyone found out he was gay, well, they knew he was gay. Once he was convicted of it, everybody turned their backs on him except for a few people. So for me, the piece is really about compassion and love in the face of adversity, and it's a basic treatise on human rights. What does it mean about how do we treat other people in the world? That sounds ridiculous, but for me, it really is this amazing treatise on human rights. What is it that is happening in the world today, and how are we treating each other, and what can we learn from Oscar Wilde? Prison completely changed Oscar Wilde. Not only is that something that we've read in biographies and we've learned from his own writing, but I think that Theo and John really highlight that in this opera, but what he really learned during those 2 years of prison by seeing other prisoners and how they were treated, young boys that were in there, people that were in there for very serious crimes and not so serious crimes, and they were all treated the same way, and they were very dehumanized while they were in prison. Well, the biggest challenge as a director with any new piece, of course, is to tell the story as economically and succinctly and beautifully as possible, and to honor Oscar Wilde's legacy. A lot of the audience is going to come in with a lot of expectations, but Oscar's a great character for an opera. What does it feel like to be Oscar Wilde at the end of his life? I always come back to that question, to feel the eyes of everybody in your city, everyone that used to love you, and suddenly they're turning their backs on you. What does that feel like? To go to prison as a fairly privileged writer who's never done a day of work in his life to suddenly have to do hard labor 6 hours a day. How does Oscar surmount that and relate to everybody else on stage? How does he learn those lessons that Theo and John outline so eloquently in the opera? And how do we reflect that in the physical production without upstaging it? That everything that we do comes back to this idea of compassion and how to break down these walls of cruelty. How to use love to open any prison door in the world. I always come back to that idea. Well, one of the most exciting things about this world premiere, this opera, is that it stars David Daniels. It was written for David Daniels. He and Theo, the composer, have a long history together. He's written for him before. David is one of the best singing actors of his generation, of any generation. He's a genius. And the idea of this outsider character being played by a countertenor, I think, is so potent. Because the countertenor voice is otherworldly. There aren't that many people in the world that can sing like that, of course, and I think that countertenors can often feel like outsiders in some ways because their voices are so different. And so this idea of this beautiful high voice playing this character that was so ostracized is so interesting to me. And then to have one of the best countertenors in the world, David Daniels, taking on the role is deeply inspiring. It's a very personal piece for him. And David has sung probably every major countertenor role in the world at this point, but they don't write a lot of new operas for countertenors. Sopranos and tenors get all kinds of new material, but it's pretty rare for a countertenor to have a juicy world premiere like this, especially a role like Oscar Wilde. Everybody can relate to having felt like an outsider at some point, or being ostracized and not included, and having people turn against you for your beliefs or for your sexuality. And David just expresses that better than anybody I've ever met. And his amazing voice, he's a great actor, and he holds the stage like nobody else, so people are in for a real treat with his performance. I hope that audiences come out of Oscar wanting to learn more about his life, wanting to read his work from a different point of view, through a different lens, appreciate it in a different way. And I hope the audience takes away this lesson of compassion. This really is an opera about human rights. And it's easy to recognize the other parts of the opera, the beautiful language, the music, Oscar says a lot of witty things in the opera. But it is a piece about human rights, not just gay rights, but about human rights, and about the way people have been persecuted for what they believe, who they are, who they love. I don't want to give away all of the inventions and all of the tricks in the story and the surprises, but it is a pure work of theater. It is a deeply theatrical piece with a huge chorus, a wonderful orchestra, and a fantastic cast of principals. And there's many surprises in the opera that I think people are going to really be very jazzed about. Santa Fe Opera is not afraid to take risks, and that's a dream as a director, to do a piece like Oscar and to put the company's name and weight behind this very beautiful story, this very edgy story, is all that I could possibly ask for as a director.